Russians have reported in their own sourcing that because the salient is so narrow, they've had a hard time resupplying it. They've had a hard time getting in and out. There's been a certain amount of geolocated footage that we've seen of the Ukrainians taking prisoners of war. Ukrainian war journals are reporting about how they're trying to now, apparently, the Ukrainians are trying to cut off the salient by attacking it at the root. And so yesterday we made some new map changes that reflect some of that reporting. And it appears that the situation has stabilized at the cost of course, having pulled units from the line, lateral redeployments from elsewhere to cover that front. So that potentially provides a little bit of liability in other parts of the line, but for now, that particular sector is stabilized. And Putin, I think, did not get what he was hoping for in Alaska on Friday. I think he was hoping for a knee-jerk reaction from the international media, particularly English language media, saying Putin and Trump are meeting in Alaska on the foreground of there being a breakthrough in Ukraine's eastern region after months of stalemated war. That was not the characterization of the war. I'm very glad that was the case.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now today, on day 1274, I think it is, of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation, we're very privileged to be talking to George Barros. Now, George is the Russia team and geospatial intelligence team lead on Russia and the Ukraine portfolio with the Institute for the Study of War. George, welcome back to Frontline.
Hey, Philip. Good to see you once again. Thanks for having me.
Well, I don't think we've got much to talk about. Nothing's really going on with regard to Ukraine or anything else. Or is it? We'll come on to the political stuff in a moment because this has been an interesting week. But I want to start with something that's happened over the last sort of week to 10 days that hasn't really got a lot of publicity. I know you and the Institute for the Study of War have been looking at the battles in the east of Ukraine. And we had a Russian breakthrough at the northern point of the cauldron as they're trying to surround Pokrovsk, and they managed to move forward sort of up to 10 to 15 kilometers with a force, but it then got stopped, blunted, cut off, and destroyed by the Ukrainians. Do you want to talk us through what you think happened and why the Russians failed in that particular maneuver?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the last week and a half, just to recap what happened, Russian forces, and I'll take a little bit of time to characterize them in this moment, they conducted a tactical infiltration task. They found a weak spot in the Ukrainian line, and they managed to penetrate the Ukrainian line by about 15 to 20 kilometers. And then they managed to extend their salient. And what happened was, I think there was a really hyperbolic overreaction to this, particularly on the social media space, saying that the Russians have achieved a breakthrough, that there's a big risk of there being an operational level breakthrough. And this was all happening on like the Monday ahead of Putin's summit with President Donald Trump in Alaska last Friday. So, look, the Russian forces, they were moving in small units. I mean, these were at most a battalion's worth of combat power, morcelized into squad or squad plus elements of between 10 people at the small end to maybe up to 50 people at largest, dismounted infantry, sometimes using motorcycles, and they also used special anti-thermal blankets to camouflage from thermal imagers to sneak in. And so this was never a mechanized assault, breaking of the line, that sort of thing. But what it did was, when all the open source intelligence mappers were trying to draw the new Russian frontline trace to accommodate this new protrusion, it created this really unwieldy shape that looked quite alarming on paper, but without the additional context about, hey, what the nature of this force is, how small it is, the fact that it was a very narrow and long penetration without really the width necessary to have a stable flank, and make it very difficult to sustain. People sort of panicked. So, and I think, not completely and rightfully so. It was a very rapid development, and it was very scary at the time. But what the Ukrainians did is within a few days, they redeployed elements of the Azov Corps to do a blocking mission. The Azov Corps, as far as we are aware, they've successfully blocked it, and then they began counterattacks at the tactical level to capture and destroy about that battalion's worth of Russian combat power. Russians have reported in their own sourcing that because the salient is so narrow, they've had a hard time resupplying it. They've had a hard time getting in and out. There's been a certain amount of geolocated footage that we've seen of the Ukrainians taking prisoners of war. Ukrainian war journals are reporting about how they're trying to now, apparently, the Ukrainians are trying to cut off the salient by attacking it at the root. And so yesterday we made some new map changes that reflect some of that reporting. And it appears that the situation has stabilized at the cost of course, having pulled units from the line, lateral redeployments from elsewhere to cover that front. So that potentially provides a little bit of liability in other parts of the line, but for now, that particular sector is stabilized. And Putin, I think, did not get what he was hoping for in Alaska on Friday. I think he was hoping for a knee-jerk reaction from the international media, particularly English language media, saying Putin and Trump are meeting in Alaska on the foreground of there being a breakthrough in Ukraine's eastern region after months of stalemated war. That was not the characterization of the war. I'm very glad that was the case. It's unclear to me if the Russian general staff specifically bespokely tailored an operation designed to achieve that effect. They very well might have. I don't know. Or if it was just circumstances that they managed to achieve that tactical mission during the time ahead of the meeting. But Putin was denied that. So that was quite a good thing. And it was an interesting episode in the war.
Yeah, but the timing was perfect for Vladimir Putin with his visit to sit down with Donald Trump. And we'll come on to that in a moment. But a number of other things came out of that struck me. Yes, it was a Russian battalion / regimental sized grouping that went in, using new methods of crossing the battlefield. From the lessons that they've learned in other parts of the battlefield. But is this the first time that we've seen a coordinated attack with that sort of level of organization? And if it is, that suggests to me that they've got some capable commanders who can think that through. But it seems that they overextended themselves by going too far forward. They hadn't thought that they were going to exploit as much, so there wasn't a follow-on force to punch through the hole that they created and then start to develop that out into a bridgehead and develop it further. So it was a lower level tactic that had a surprising success rather than being coordinated by higher level formation as part of a bigger plan. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't have the Russian, operational plans to know for a fact. My suspicion is that it was more likely the latter. The tactics are not new. They've been using dismounted infantry and infiltration tactics. They've been using space blankets before. They've used motorcycles before. Now, the echelon's interesting. Did they deliberately deploy a battalion or a regiment minus in order to do this specifically as a task organized force? Or did it just so happen that they had tactical successes with some small squad-sized units, and then the local commander decided, well, we seem to have found a soft spot here in the line, just send some more, and then it ended up being roughly a battalion's worth of combat power. I actually don't know, but we're not sure. But what I do know is that the Russians, they fight like water. They act like a bunch of water you throw on a bunch of rocks, which is when they hit a hard spot, they try to bypass, they try to find these tactical nooks and crannies where they can make ins. And then when they find the ins, they then reinforce it. And so it seems that those forces that got to this tactical penetration near Dobropilia, they found a soft spot, that's for sure. They found an undermanned part of the line, and they reinforced it. And they might have gone too far, too fast, overextended their lines, sort of the classic blunder of 2022 for the Russians, but on a much smaller scale, and made themselves vulnerable to a counterattack.
Yeah, and then looking from the Ukrainian side, they've got this new core structure now. As we discussed beforehand, they haven't had enough time to really get everything in place and to start to fight as a core. But we saw elements of the Azov Corps, and I think it was the 12th Special Forces Brigade that were moved forward in a couple of days. Do you think they were pulled out from the front line elsewhere, or was that a reserve formation or a formation that was being refurbished after having been brought back from the front line and used as a reserve to then blunt this Russian attack and then to deal with it? And does that show a level of coordination at a higher level with the Ukrainian military than we've seen beforehand? Because a lot of their structures until they started to transition into this core structure, were very geographically based, and the commanders didn't know and really didn't care who was to the left, who was to the right, and there's no one coordinating different activities between them. Is this a sea change in Ukrainian tactics?
So on the we can have a separate discussion about Ukraine's adoption of the core structure, which is a great change on paper, and I think it'll mature and become a very effective way of organizing their tactical brigades. In terms of this specific episode with the Azov Corps, so elements of the Azov Corps, the several brigades that are part of the Corps, they were deployed. Many of them were deployed across the theater. Some of them were in northern Donetsk. Some of them were closer to the Kharkiv Luhansk line. At least in recent months that we could find in open source reporting. Some of the brigades were unaccounted for, so perhaps they might have been pulled from the line recently or were sitting in reserve. And when they redeployed the Corps, it's unclear if they took all of the brigades with them, or just the Corps headquarters and several of the brigades. So I'm not exactly sure on the size of the redeployment, but what we do know is that of the several new corps the Ukrainians created, there's a couple standout corps that are highly effective, highly professional, highly motivated. The Azov Corps is certainly one of them. And so the Ukrainian command took one of their best corps to respond to this emergency contingency that they had near Dobropilia. And they conducted what appears to have been a pretty successful, or at least so far effective, blocking movement. And I must say, to your point exactly, yes. I mean, the Ukrainian military, before having the core structure, it was a series of close to 100 separate maneuver brigades from a variety of different places, and they were oftentimes having very unclear command and control relationships to the higher level operational group, the groups of forces. So, like you would previously hear about the Hortitsa group of forces, and that might have many brigades subordinate to it, and sometimes the area of responsibility between where one brigade begins and ends is not clear. Rotations have historically been a problem, and so there's always been a requirement for there being a middle level echelon. There was a debate: should it be a division or should there be a corps? Really, I think that's like a semantical difference. You need to have an echelon between the separate brigades and the higher level operational group. That's what the corps now does. And I think it's a very good thing for command and control. Now, this will be the segue to the bigger discussion about the core system. Obviously, and you know this well from your own experience, just because you create the headquarters doesn't mean that it starts operating as a core. You actually have to have, experienced core commanders and an experienced core staff who can effectively do all the things that you need to have basically the joint staff do for the corps. And then you have to have brigade commanders who are amenable and able to work effectively with each other at the brigade level, but also with the corps commander. And, due to the fact that Ukraine's a small country and many Ukrainian officers have been killed, and many, former field grade officers have been promoted very quickly, there's not a whole lot of qualified staff personnel to fill out all the new professional staff positions in the corps, or if they exist, they're relatively green people. And so building out those staffs and professionalizing them is going to be they got big shoes to fill. And once it matures, and if they're successful maturing, then yes, I think the Ukrainian Corps with brigades working together, that's going to be a very robust structure to work against the hodgepodge mid speed of the Russians sending dismounted squads, but in mass. That's a very good way to fight this, and I could see a numerically inferior Ukrainian army, but organized in a really effective way, fighting against hordes of disorganized Russians.
It's interesting. A lot of Ukrainian officers, well, sorry, not a lot, a number of Ukrainian officers will have been trained in core tactics in the different allied staff colleges around the world that they've been attending since the mid 1990s. I remember the first Ukrainian staff officer coming through the Advanced Command and Staff College course that the UK run for their aspiring senior officers, and it's all core level tactics that are there. And uh, but there's a difference between being trained on it in a school and then going into a corps headquarters and being able to practice your fighting at corps level, and then going out and actually doing it whilst you're fighting a high intensity conflict. You're changing your tactics from squad level the whole way up because even your basic equipment's changing, and you're trying to bring in equipment that the majority of your people aren't familiar with, and bring in a lot of civilians into your military and integrate those into what's going on. Do you think we miss the fact of the complexity of what the Ukrainians have been achieving in their restructuring through the conflict so far, as they're fighting a high intensity conflict, and we are expecting them to do too much? Do you think any country in the West could do this?
You got to grade the Ukrainians on a curve, right? So no nation in the last really 80 years has had to do what the Ukrainians have had to do, which is reform a Soviet inherited system that does not have excellent civilian control over the military. Do that while fighting the largest combined arms war in Europe since 1945, while relying on foreign allies who are not doing a lend-lease for you to bankroll or support your defense industry, while being massively numerically overgunned. So this is a extraordinarily difficult undertaking, and certainly the Ukrainians are not perfect. I don't. No one is, obviously, in this military science business, but you really do have to grade them on a curve. And the Ukrainians have been making, I think, wonderful strides and steps. There's been bumps along the ways, there are challenges along the ways. I think, like a lot of the frictions that we've seen between Zelensky and Syrskyi, and Zelensky and his previous and Syrskyi's predecessor Zaluzhny, who's now the ambassador to the UK. I mean, those are normal, healthy features of what it means to have civilian control over the military, and quite normal. And I think a lot of times for the layman who is not a student of military science, they can look a lot more dysfunctional than it really is. But when you actually do read about the historical challenges that military professionals undertake in the discipline, and you compare that to the Ukraine example, you see the parallels, you see the challenges, you can contextualize all the things, and you realize that the Ukrainians have been dealt a very difficult hand, and they're really doing their best, and they're actually doing very well considering the circumstances. That's not to say that they've been perfect, but they're doing quite well. And to your conversation earlier about the staff colleges, I mean that's so incredibly important, because I suspect many viewers and listeners, unless they have a military background, they don't understand that Ukraine does not have military academies to train staff officers and commanders really above battalion or brigade level. You do need to go to the UK or Germany or the United States to get that higher level military education. And the Ukrainians have been trying to achieve that, and they're trying to reform their Soviet inherited system. And really, it does require a generational shift, an entire new generation of a professional officer corps to actually facilitate that. They've been working on it for decades, and so for that reason, the support that we as the collective West provide Ukraine, not just in the bullets and the systems and the economic and financial systems, but also the military education, all this stuff is so incredibly important. And this is truly a place where the Ukrainians can help themselves, because without the educational institutions that we have, this is something they cannot do on their own, even if they wanted to.
Yeah, yeah, no, and it's something that I've been thinking about this hard, and I've been involved in restructuring the British Army and worked very closely with all of the NATO allies and the United States and everything else. I don't think there's any nation could do what the Ukrainians are doing easily. We'd have difficulty trying to think through it, and we'd certainly not be doing it any better than the Ukrainians are doing. But lifting us back up into the geopolitical sphere again, this has been a busy week with, first of all, Donald Trump meeting Vladimir Putin. What was your reading on that?
Well, look, it was. You're catching me at an awkward place here, because I want to have very strong words for this, but I want to try to be diplomatic. Look, I think that was a massive win for Vladimir Putin, because, and there really was no decisive breakthrough there. It's unclear to me what the United States achieved from that. I don't think we walked away with anything from that, really. the supposedly the big crown achievement of what the U.S. got from that was the Russians willing to make concessions on their war and their willingness to allow Ukraine to receive Article 5 like security guarantees. But then just yesterday, the Russian Foreign Ministry very forcefully asserted that they are opposed to there being any NATO member states to deploy military contingents to Ukraine. And I would argue that without any such deployments, you don't have an Article 5 like security guarantee, or if you want to call it that on paper, it's not credible. And the Ukrainians arguably already had that in the form of the Budapest Memorandum. So what distinguishes that from the Article 5 like guarantees, I don't know. But Putin got his handshake with Trump. He successfully evaded the deadline for the sanctions, the secondary sanctions on the purchases of Russian oil, which President Trump had been threatening.
And they seem to have disappeared as well. President Trump hasn't mentioned them again and talked of bringing them in.
Correct. That appears to be the case for now. The U.S. Senate, on the other hand, they are gung ho and ready to slap down the sanctions if the talks fail and the negotiations break. But as far as the administration is concerned, we're currently in negotiations mode, and so it would not be constructive to do that this time. But yes, I agree. That was a big win for Putin. He managed to undo some of the geopolitical isolation that the international community had been doing to Putin for his war crimes and other various crimes against humanity. And so for those reasons, and the Russians, they stalled and they bought time. So we're now going to have to rediscover the obvious, which is the Russians, for the most part, are not willing to make any sort of meaningful concessions. And they got an opportunity to whisper to the president's ear about how it's okay if you cede Donetsk Oblast for a ceasefire, not for conflict termination, but for a ceasefire, we can then negotiate conflict termination. And that appears to be the big concession that we are trying to have the Ukrainians make to facilitate the conflict termination agreement. So these are, a lot of Russian wins. It's unclear to me exactly what we achieved in doing other than nominally resuming talks with the Russians so that they can then make unilateral demands where we make all the concessions and then they make zero concessions. But here we are now.
Well, it's interesting. UK Defence Intelligence this week, just before the meeting between the European leaders and with Keir Starmer from the UK and President Trump and President Zelensky in the White House, put out a little study where they'd analysed the length of time it had taken the Russians to capture the territory in Donetsk that they have at the moment, extrapolated that and extrapolated the casualties to see how long it would take them to take the rest of Donetsk. They calculated about another 4 years and about another 1.9 million casualties. So there's no wonder Vladimir Putin is trying to get that written into any peace agreement, because he hasn't got another 4 years and 1.9 million people's worth of goodwill amongst the Russian people, I think.
No, exactly. And it was unfortunate to see President Trump walk away from the meeting on Friday, apparently seemingly convinced by from his own statements that the Russians are going to seize all Donetsk anyway pretty soon. So why not just therefore save us the trouble and negotiate it away? Completely agree with that assessment from the UK intelligence, by the way. In our assessment, it'll be a multi-year undertaking to seize all of Donetsk Oblast because of the terrain that they have to fight through, the fortress cities they have to fight through. If you're interested, we did our own geospatial analysis to look at it as well, and I can share our numbers, which are probably less sophisticated than what the MOD provided, but there was a recent American intelligence leak that supposedly the Russians would seize Donetsk by October of this year, and I must say, strongly disagree with that assessment, or at least I think it's being misreported. I think that was the most dangerous course of action, sort of the high water mark in terms of the forecast cone, and of course, there's going to be the most likely course of action, for the audience's awareness when you do an intelligence product as an intelligence professional. You warn the policymaker about, hey, here's the grand scope of things you have to worry about. Worst case scenario, which is definitionally very unlikely, versus here what we think is going to happen. And I suspect the worst case scenario was that October number that's being quoted everywhere, but that is definitionally the absolute worst case scenario. It's not likely to happen. It will be a multi-year undertaking.
Yeah, worst case, best case, most likely is what we bring in from a planning perspective, and then the reality is usually something completely different, and that's the realms of an intelligence officer and a planning officer because I've done both. But Alaska, the telling bit for me was Donald Trump's body language whenever he shook the hands of Vladimir Putin first of all, and then you get the B-2 bomber with the was it F-22s or F-35s flying overhead as they walk past the F-22s, and then the difference in the body language between the handshake at the press conference after they'd had the negotiations. Um, Putin's body language didn't change. Donald Trump clearly was feeling slightly bruised, was my reading of what had happened. Of course, we don't know what happened behind closed doors. But do you think that translated into Donald Trump and his behavior then in the Oval Office whenever Zelensky came in with the European leaders and Keir Starmer of the UK and Ursula von der Leyen from the EU and Mark Rutte from NATO, which was a big delegate supporting Zelensky. Um, did that help there not be another ambush in the Oval Office? Or do you think Donald Trump was feeling conciliatory anyway, feeling slightly bruised potentially after Alaska?
Look, I don't know what Donald Trump was thinking at Alaska. What I do know is that they did not have their planned celebratory luncheon that was supposed to happen. That didn't occur. And we do know that I don't know this. I suspect Donald Trump is likely going to ultimately regret having met with Putin in Alaska, given that again I'm not sure exactly what that did for him because I suspect that the negotiations are going to run into a stalemate, and we'll have more years of war fighting ahead of us. I think that's the most likely course of action. Um, I think that when meeting with Zelensky just yesterday in the Oval Office with the European leaders, that went very well. I don't know if Donald Trump was looking to be conciliatory, but I think Donald Trump understands the reality that the likelihood of this failing dramatically and this being a tarnish on his legacy is quite high. He understands that if the Ukrainians don't receive robust security guarantees, then there is nothing that is going to have the Russians restart the war. That's why yesterday's discussion was so focused on what Ukrainian security guarantees look like and what the necessary Ukrainian concessions should be. So I think Trump understands that. And he understands that if he, he will become the Neville Chamberlain of his times in the United States if this goes awry. So he's trying to avoid that. And the meeting went well. Zelensky didn't step on any landmines. It doesn't appear that anyone's put any landmines out for Zelensky to step on. The European leaders all spoke very eloquently and very well, and I think they're all on the same page. So I think the meeting went essentially as well as it could. And now, of course, we await to hear what concessions the Russians are willing to make. They have, of course, not mentioned any so far in the course of this war. If they do offer any real concessions, then that would be a massive inflection in the war. But we have to be really clear-eyed because the Russians have floated ideas and various things which they present as putative concessions, but in fact are not concessions. For example, Steve Witkoff left the talks recently with the Russians, saying that the Russians promise that they're willing to, amend their constitution or change the legal basis to the promise they'll never attack Ukraine again. And that, of course, is not a real concession because Vladimir Putin, after promising the Russian nation for decades he would never change the Russian constitution, changed the Russian constitution in 2020 to allow him to reset his term counter and then allow him to continue being Russian president of 2036. And so, the Russian constitution isn't really worth much. They changed.
Well, yeah, I think Steve Witkoff is the perfect example of why you should not use people who have got no diplomatic experience to carry out complex diplomatic tasks and everything else. But do you think Donald Trump has realized that the only deal he's going to get out of all of this, because he keeps talking about the deal, is the one that President Zelensky presented him with, which was $100 billion of US weapons to be bought using European and EU money. And that's the sort of deal that will keep Donald Trump on Ukrainian and Europe side because Putin can't come up with the similar sorts of numbers. And as a sort of follow up, do you think that the proposal by Zelensky and Donald Trump that the next meeting will be a trilateral will ever happen?
So reading the tea leaves of yesterday, um, Ushakov, the Russian presidential aide, made a statement, and there was a Kremlin statement, and notably, Trump's there was a great divide between the American readout of the conversation and what events were to follow, and the Kremlin readout from Ushakov. So Donald Trump's Truth Social statement mentioned that they're going to have a trilateral, and they're going to work to try to do that. The Russian statement discusses how the Russian side and the Russian delegation is prepared to talk with the Ukrainian delegation, but made no mention of it being a presidential level, and it made no mention of a trilateral. So there appears to be a disconnect. Now, this could be ameliorated, of course, through more talking and massaging, but that immediate disconnect seemed quite striking. So I remain skeptical that President Trump and President Putin, or pardon me, President Trump and President Putin and President Zelensky will actually have a bilateral, because of course Putin has been decrying every Ukrainian president since Viktor Yanukovych was ousted in 2014 as illegitimate. And I think the likelihood of a trilateral is quite low as well. But again, a trilateral or a bilateral in order to do what? In order for the Russians to keep stonewalling. So oftentimes I feel like these meetings are sort of presented as a means into themselves, and of course they're meant to facilitate greater things. And without the Russians actually, changing, that's important. And most importantly, the logic is completely messed up here, because the Russians right now at the tactical level of war are winning, as we know. They're winning tactically. Without a more cogent Ukrainian theory of victory, they will win strategically if we draw this out in the long run, I think. And so for the side that has an actual theory of victory and that is winning tactically but not yet operationally, to then say, yeah, we're gonna stop the war, and we're gonna make a series of concessions, and we're gonna allow the Ukrainian side to have security guarantees. That's sort of antithetical to principles of strategy. In order to make the Russians actually get to that point, you have to make them lose. You have to impose defeats on them. You have to make them stop winning at the tactical level. Ideally, you have to start losing at the tactical level, so they actually do make concessions. And I would think in the terms of statecraft that that's a prerequisite for having these successful negotiations. But it appears to be me that we're attempting to achieve these goals without imposing those prerequisites.
Well, George, we talked earlier about differences of opinion and how important that was between political leaders and military leaders. I've got a slightly different opinion on the tactical side. Yes, Russia is advancing. I'll not necessarily say winning, because they're pushing the Ukrainians back, but I'll not say that that's a win. At the operational level, Ukraine is carrying out a much more effective campaign and dealing with Russia's ability to continue to support its tactical operations with Ukraine's attacks on its train infrastructure, its ammunition depots, its airfields, its generals, its oil infrastructure, being able to finance and everything else. And therefore that operational level is probably where the conflict is going to be ultimately won or lost. But as ever, this gives us lots to talk about in the future. So, George, it's been a real pleasure talking to you again today on Frontline.
Thank you, Philip. Indeed, we'll have a lot of interesting conversations ahead of us. And thanks.
Definitely. And I think we're going to be at this for quite some time.
I agree with that assessment.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.